What happens when the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany tries to cut a deal with America, and Washington responds not with negotiation, but with a radio broadcast? This is the true story of how American intelligence officers used nothing more than information and a microphone to dismantle Heinrich Himmler's empire without firing a single shot. It's a tale of psychological warfare at its finest, where American strategic brilliance exposed Nazi delusion in real time, turning Hitler's most loyal follower into his greatest traitor, all through the simple, devastating power of truth. April 23, 1945. A villa near Lübeck, Germany. 2:17 in the morning. The curtains in Count Folke Bernadotta's borrowed study stirred in the pre-dawn cold. Heinrich Himmler sat across from the Swedish diplomat, his small hands trembling slightly as they rested on the mahogany table between them. The Reich leader of the SS, architect of the Holocaust, commander of millions, the man who had sent countless souls to their deaths with the stroke of a pen, looked somehow diminished in the lamplight. His wire-rimmed glasses caught the glow, transforming his eyes into twin circles of reflected fire. Behind those circles, a mind was calculating, scheming, convinced of its own indispensability. "The Americans will understand," Himmler said, his voice carrying that peculiar mixture of certainty and desperation that marks men who have confused their fantasies with fate. "When I offer them Germany, organized, functional Germany, to stand against the Bolshevik tide, they will see reason. Roosevelt is dead. This new man, Truman, he will be practical." Bernadotte said nothing. He had learned in his years of Red Cross diplomacy that silence often revealed more than questions. Himmler leaned forward, and the lamplight caught the worry lines etching deeper into his receding forehead. "I will order all SS and Wehrmacht units on the Western Front to lay down their arms. Unconditional surrender. To Eisenhower, to Montgomery, to the Americans and British. But in the East, we continue fighting. We hold the line against Stalin. Together, we, Germany and the West, we stop the Red Army." He paused, and something almost childlike crossed his face. "They need me. The Allies need order. They need someone who understands how to organize things." The word organize hung in the air, heavy with its terrible double meaning. This was the man who had organized the final solution, who had organized the Einsatzgruppen, who had organized the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others. And now, in the collapsing death throes of his Reich, he believed he could organize his way into Allied favor. What Himmler could not see, what his ideology had blinded him to completely, was that 300 miles west in Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, American intelligence officers and British colleagues were preparing a response that would prove far more devastating than any bullet. They were preparing to tell the truth. The architecture of delusion. To understand the magnitude of Himmler's miscalculation, one must first understand the world he inhabited in April of 1945. Not the real world of collapsed fronts and burning cities, but the phantom world constructed inside the Nazi leadership's collective imagination. Heinrich Himmler had spent 12 years building an empire within an empire. The SES, his black uniformed legions, numbered over 1 million men. The Gestapo, his secret police, had files on virtually every German citizen. The concentration camps, his archipelago of horror, stretched across occupied Europe. He controlled the Waffen-SS, elite combat divisions that rivaled the Wehrmacht. He administered vast industrial enterprises worked by slave labor. He had, or believed he had, the power of life and death over a continent. But power had done to Himmler what it does to all men who hold it absolutely. It had separated him from reality like a cancer separating healthy tissue. By the spring of 1945, the gap between his perception and the world as it actually existed had become a chasm. Consider the evidence available to any rational observer. The Red Army stood on the Oder River, 40 miles from Berlin. American and British forces had crossed the Rhine and were sweeping across western Germany, capturing entire army groups. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, had been reduced to a handful of jets flown by teenage boys. German cities were burning. Supply lines had collapsed. The industrial heartland of the Ruhr had fallen. In Berlin itself, Hitler cowered in his bunker, while Soviet artillery reduced the city to rubble. Yet Himmler, looking at this same landscape of apocalypse, saw opportunity. His reasoning followed a terrible logic, one rooted in the fundamental Nazi misunderstanding of their enemies. The Nazis had always projected their own ideological obsessions onto others. They believed that anti-Bolshevism would override all other considerations, just as anti-Semitism had overridden German humanity. They believed that the Western Allies were fundamentally weak, corrupted by democracy and Jewish influence, and would therefore crack under pressure. They believed that Churchill and now Truman were, like themselves, ultimately pragmatists who would make any deal to serve national interest. Most fatally, they believed that the Americans, efficient, organized Americans, would appreciate efficiency and organization above all else. And who better to provide that than Heinrich Himmler, master organizer? Lieutenant Colonel William Sterling, an intelligence officer with the Office of Strategic Services attached to SHAF, would later describe this mindset in his debriefing report. Himmler genuinely seemed to believe that his administrative capabilities would be valued. He thought we would see him as a technocrat, not a murderer. It was a staggering failure of empathy. He literally could not conceive that we saw him as anything other than a tool to be used. This failure of empathy was not Himmler's alone. It infected the entire Nazi leadership like a virus of the mind. They had spent so long dehumanizing their victims that they had lost the ability to imagine themselves through others' eyes. The camps, the massacres, the industrial-scale murder, these were in their minds merely administrative challenges successfully overcome. Surely the Americans, practical people that they were, would recognize competence when they saw it. This was the delusion that brought Himmler to that villa near Lübeck in the early morning darkness of April 23rd. Through Bernadotte, through Swedish channels, he would make his offer. The Western Front would fold like a paper crane. Germany would pivot, become the West's ally against Stalin. He, Heinrich Himmler, would be received not as a war criminal, but as a statesman, as the pragmatic leader of a new Germany. The sun rose over the Baltic that morning, painting the sky in shades of copper and ash. By the time its light reached Berlin, Himmler's letter was already being encoded for transmission to Stockholm, and from there to London and Washington. He had made his gamble. In SHAF headquarters, American intelligence officers were about to call his bluff in a way he could never have imagined. The American response: truth as a weapon. Major General Kenneth Strong, Eisenhower's British intelligence chief, received the decoded message at 0830 hours on April 24th. He read it twice, then walked it personally to Eisenhower's office. The Supreme Commander was bent over maps of the Elbe River crossing when Strong entered. Eisenhower looked up, saw Strong's expression, and said, "This ought to be good." Strong handed him the message. Eisenhower read it in silence. When he finished, he removed his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, a gesture those who knew him recognized as a sign of controlled anger. "He wants to what?" Eisenhower said quietly. "Surrender the Western Front only, sir. Continue fighting the Russians. He seems to believe we'll accept him as some kind of negotiating partner." Eisenhower stood, walked to the window, stared out at the compound. American soldiers were drilling on the parade ground, their movements precise and confident. These were the men who had fought from Normandy to the heart of Germany. They had liberated Buchenwald just 12 days earlier. They had seen the evidence of Nazi atrocity with their own eyes. "Get me Marshall in Washington," Eisenhower said, "and get Churchill on the line. We need to coordinate this carefully." What happened in the next 18 hours demonstrates, perhaps more clearly than any battle, the sophistication of American strategic thinking in World War II. The United States and Britain were facing a delicate situation. Stalin was paranoid, constantly suspecting that the Western Allies might make a separate peace with Germany. Any hint that such negotiations were occurring, even negotiations that would be rejected, could fracture the alliance at its moment of triumph. Moreover, there was Hitler himself to consider. The Führer was in his bunker, increasingly paranoid and erratic, but still nominally in command of German forces. If Himmler's offer became known to him, what would his reaction be? These were the considerations that American strategic planners, working in concert with their British counterparts, had to balance. And the solution they arrived at was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. They would not negotiate with Himmler. They would not meet with his representatives. They would not engage in any way that could be construed as recognition of his authority or legitimacy. Instead, they would do something far more powerful. They would expose him completely, publicly, immediately. Colonel Ralph Ingersoll, who worked in the Psychological Warfare Division, later explained the reasoning. We realized that Himmler's approach was based entirely on secrecy. He was trying to split the alliance, to create a fait accompli that would force our hand. Our counter was to eliminate the secrecy. Once his offer was public, it became worthless to us and poison to him. The mechanism chosen was brutal in its efficiency: the BBC. At 1900 hours Greenwich Mean Time on April 28, 1945, Reuters news service flashed a bulletin across its wires. Within minutes, BBC Radio, broadcast in German, English, and Russian, carried the story. The announcement was read by the BBC's senior announcer, his voice carrying that peculiar mixture of British sang-froid and barely suppressed satisfaction. The Reuters news agency has learned that Heinrich Himmler, Reich leader of the SS, has approached the Western Allies through Swedish intermediaries with an offer to surrender German forces on the Western Front while continuing to fight the Soviet Union in the East. This offer has been rejected by the Allied governments. The British and American governments have informed Marshal Stalin of Himmler's approach and have reaffirmed their commitment to accepting only unconditional surrender on all fronts simultaneously. The broadcast continued for perhaps 90 seconds. It was factual, precise, unemotional. It simply stated what had happened, but its impact would be explosive. The bunker. When truth becomes a grenade. Adolf Hitler heard the broadcast at approximately 2000 hours, April 28, 1945. He was in the Führer bunker, 50 feet beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden in Berlin. The bunker's concrete walls were vibrating with the impact of Soviet artillery shells. The air stank of mildew, diesel fuel from the generators, and the sweat of people who had not seen sunlight in weeks. Hitler had been monitoring BBC broadcasts obsessively, partly for intelligence, partly because German radio had become unreliable, partly because at some level he needed to hear the voice of his enemies. When the announcement about Himmler came through the static, he was seated at the conference table with Martin Bormann and Joseph Goebbels. Eyewitness accounts from the surviving bunker personnel describe what happened next with an almost clinical horror. Hitler's face went white, not red with rage as it often did, but white, the color of absolute shock. His hands began to shake. The tremor that had affected his left side for months became violent. "What?" he said. "What?" Goebbels, whose ability to read Hitler's moods had kept him alive for 12 years, immediately moved to change the subject. But Hitler raised his hand, that shaking hand, for silence. "Play it again," he ordered. The broadcast was not being recorded, but within minutes another BBC bulletin repeated the essential details. Hitler listened with an expression that survivors later described as beyond rage. It was the look of a man watching the last support beam of his world snap. "Himmler," Hitler said, and the name came out as something between a whisper and a scream. Der treue Heinrich, faithful Heinrich. The irony was lost on no one in that bunker. For 12 years, Himmler had been Hitler's shadow, his loyal executor, the man who had implemented every dark vision of the Nazi state. When Hitler had wanted the SA leadership purged in 1934, Himmler organized it. When Hitler had wanted the Jews eliminated, Himmler organized it. when Hitler had needed someone to run the occupation of Poland, the suppression of resistance movements, the entire apparatus of terror. Himmler had organized it all, efficiently, ruthlessly, without question. And now, with the Reich in its death throes, faithful Heinrich had tried to make his own deal, had tried to use the power Hitler had given him to negotiate his own survival, had tried, in effect, to become Hitler's replacement in the eyes of the West. What Hitler understood in that moment, what the American broadcast had made crystal clear to him, was that Himmler had not merely betrayed him politically. Himmler had revealed his own belief that Hitler was finished, that the Reich was finished, that the time had come to salvage what could be salvaged. It was the ultimate betrayal, and it was now public knowledge, broadcast to the world. Hitler's rage, when it finally came, was apocalyptic. Witnesses reported that he screamed for nearly 30 minutes. He accused Himmler of cowardice, of stupidity, of treachery beyond all treachery. He declared Himmler expelled from all party offices, stripped of all ranks, declared a traitor to the Reich. He ordered Himmler's immediate arrest and execution. But the orders, of course, could not be carried out. The communications networks had collapsed. The SS units that might have carried out such orders were scattered, surrounded, or already surrendering. And Himmler himself was somewhere in northern Germany, beyond Hitler's reach. The Americans, without firing a shot, had achieved something extraordinary. They had turned Hitler's most powerful subordinate into his most wanted enemy. They had taken the second pillar of the Nazi state and removed it, not through capture or killing, but through simple public exposure. Major General Strong would later write in his memoirs, "The beauty of the broadcast strategy was its efficiency. We didn't have to hunt Himmler. We didn't have to put resources into eliminating him. Hitler would do that for us, or at least Hitler would ensure that Himmler's authority was destroyed. In one announcement, we had neutralized both men." The unraveling. A master of death becomes a fugitive. For Heinrich Himmler, the BBC broadcast transformed reality in an instant. One moment he was the Reich leader SS, the second most powerful man in Germany, the man negotiating with the Western Allies on behalf of a new government. The next moment he was nothing. The news reached him through his aide, SS Obergruppenführer Karl Gebhardt, at a farmhouse near Flensburg on the morning of April 29th. Gebhardt's face was ashen as he entered the room where Himmler was taking breakfast, weak tea and stale bread, the fare of a collapsing Reich. "Mein Reichsführer," Gebhardt said, and the title already sounded hollow. "The BBC has announced your approach to the Allies. The Führer knows. He has stripped you of all ranks and ordered your arrest." Himmler set down his teacup. His hand was steady. One had to grant him that. Whatever else he was not a physical coward. "Hitler knows?" he said. "The entire world knows, mein Reichsführer. The broadcast went out yesterday evening. Moscow has already responded. Stalin is demanding clarification from Roosevelt and Churchill. The Führer is... the reports say he is in a rage." Himmler stood, walked to the window. Outside, German soldiers were retreating northward in disorganized streams. The Wehrmacht, the once mighty German military machine, was dissolving like salt in water. "How did they know?" Himmler said. "The Swedes." Bernadotte promised confidentiality. This was the question that would haunt Himmler in his final days. He never understood, perhaps never could understand, that the Americans had no interest in confidentiality, that they had deliberately publicized his approach precisely because publicity destroyed its value. He had thought he was negotiating with pragmatists who would seize an opportunity. He had not understood that he was dealing with strategists who saw several moves ahead, who understood that information could be a weapon more powerful than any tank. What followed was a descent into absurdity that would have been comic if it had not been so grimly appropriate. Heinrich Himmler, architect of the final solution, master of the apparatus of Nazi terror, was reduced to a fugitive with a fake identity and an eye patch. The eye patch was Himmler's own idea. He removed his distinctive wire-rimmed glasses, the glasses that had appeared in 1,000 photographs, and replaced them with a black patch over one eye, hoping to alter his appearance enough to slip through Allied checkpoints. He took the identity papers of a dead Gestapo agent named Heinrich Hitzinger, a sergeant in the secret field police. He shaved his mustache. He joined a small group of retreating SS officers, all similarly disguised. It was pathetic. The man who had controlled the lives of millions was now pretending to be a non-commissioned officer, hoping not to be recognized. For 2 weeks, Himmler and his group wandered through northern Germany. The landscape was chaos. Millions of displaced persons, former concentration camp inmates, slave laborers, refugees, clogged the roads. Allied forces were everywhere, setting up checkpoints, processing prisoners. The vaunted German organization had collapsed into medieval confusion. On May 21, 1945, Himmler's group approached a British checkpoint near Bremervörde. The checkpoint was manned by soldiers of the British Second Army, veterans who had fought their way from Normandy. They had seen Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau. They knew what the SS had done. The sergeant in charge, a man named Edwin Austin, later described the encounter. They looked like any other group of defeated German soldiers, dirty, tired, trying to pretend they were just following orders. But something about one of them caught my eye. He had this eye patch, but his bearing was different. The way he held himself, and his hands, they were soft. Not the hands of a man who'd been in combat. Austin ordered the group to stop. He began checking their papers. When he came to Heinrich Himmler, he looked at the man's face, then at the identity card, then back at the face. "Remove the eye patch," Austin said in German. Himmler hesitated. In that hesitation, Austin knew. I said, "Remove it." Himmler removed the patch. Without his glasses, his eyes were weak, watery, uncertain, but the face was unmistakable. Austin had seen photographs. Every British soldier had seen photographs of the Nazi leadership. This was Heinrich Himmler. "My name is Heinrich Himmler," the prisoner said, perhaps hoping that an admission of identity would somehow help him. "I wish to speak with British command." Austin's hand moved to his rifle. Not to shoot. The British Army did not execute prisoners of war, not even this one, but simply as a reflexive response to being in the presence of profound evil. "Secure this man," Austin ordered. "Get him to headquarters immediately." The final act. The chemistry of defeat. They took Himmler to a British interrogation facility at Lüneburg, 20 miles to the south. The journey was surreal. Himmler sat in the back of a British jeep, flanked by armed guards, watching the landscape of his destroyed Reich pass by. Villages bombed to rubble, factories standing like blackened skeletons, columns of refugees moving in all directions. This was what he had helped create, what his ideology and his efficiency had produced. At Lüneburg, British intelligence officers prepared to interrogate him. The protocols were clear. All high-ranking Nazi prisoners were to be searched thoroughly before questioning. This was not merely procedure. After years of fighting the Nazi intelligence apparatus, British and American officers had learned that SS officers in particular often carried concealed weapons or poison. The search was conducted by Captain C.J.L. Wells, a medical officer attached to British intelligence. Wells later testified that he had been thorough. Himmler was stripped, his clothing examined, his body searched. No weapons were found. No poison was found. Wells believed he had been comprehensive. He had not been comprehensive enough. At approximately 2300 hours on May 23, 1945, during a routine secondary search before formal interrogation, Himmler was ordered to open his mouth. A British sergeant was checking for concealed items, a standard procedure, but one that had not been performed during the initial search. Himmler opened his mouth. The sergeant saw something small and dark lodged in Himmler's back teeth. A capsule. "He's got something," the sergeant said. "He's got—" Himmler bit down. The capsule contained potassium cyanide, approximately 15 milligrams, enough to kill within seconds. Himmler had carried it there throughout his journey, throughout his arrest, throughout the initial search. It had been his final plan, his last measure of control. The effect was immediate and horrible. Cyanide works by preventing cells from using oxygen. Himmler's face turned blue. He began convulsing. British medical officers rushed to save him, not because they wanted him to live necessarily, but because they wanted him to face justice, to testify, to answer for his crimes in a court of law. They failed. 12 minutes after he bit down on the capsule, Heinrich Himmler was dead. Captain Wells, writing his report later that night, noted, "The subject exhibited no remorse, no fear, and no interest in cooperating with interrogation. His suicide appeared to be a final act of control rather than an act of cowardice. He denied us the opportunity to put him on trial." This was true, but it was also incomplete. Himmler's suicide was not merely about control. It was about the complete collapse of his worldview. In those final days, wandering through Germany with a fake identity, he had been forced to confront the absolute failure of his gamble. The Americans had not negotiated with him. The British had not accepted him as a partner. Stalin, informed of his approach, had used it as propaganda fodder. Hitler, his Führer, had declared him a traitor. He had no allies, no leverage, no future. The man who had organized the deaths of millions had been outmaneuvered by adversaries who understood something he never could, that truth, properly deployed, can be more devastating than any lie. The American lesson, psychological warfare at its finest. In the weeks following Himmler's death, American intelligence officers conducted extensive debriefings and analysis of the episode. What emerged was a case study in psychological warfare that would influence American strategic thinking for decades. Colonel William Donovan, head of the Office of Strategic Services, wrote in a classified report, "The Himmler affair demonstrates that information, timing, and an understanding of our adversary's psychology can achieve strategic objectives without kinetic operations." By broadcasting Himmler's approach rather than negotiating with it, we accomplished three objectives simultaneously. We reassured Stalin of our commitment to the alliance, we destroyed Himmler's authority within the Nazi leadership, and we demonstrated to the German people that their leaders were attempting to save themselves while leaving ordinary Germans to face the consequences of their regime's crimes. This last point was perhaps the most important. Throughout the war, American psychological warfare had sought to drive a wedge between the Nazi leadership and the German population. The revelation of Himmler's attempted deal, his willingness to sacrifice German soldiers in the East while saving those in the West, was powerful propaganda. It showed that Nazi ideology, with all its rhetoric of racial solidarity and national destiny, was ultimately hollow. When faced with defeat, the Nazi leaders thought first of their own survival. The broadcast strategy also demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of Hitler's psychology. American analysts working with refugee psychologists who had studied the Nazi leadership had predicted that Hitler would react with extreme rage to any perceived betrayal, especially by someone as close as Himmler. By making the betrayal public, the Americans ensured that Hitler's rage would have maximum impact, paralyzing what remained of German command structures at a critical moment. Moreover, the strategy showed confidence. A weaker alliance might have been tempted to explore Himmler's offer, if only to see what advantage could be gained. But the Americans and British understood that they were winning, that Germany was collapsing, and that they could afford to reject categorically any attempt at a separate peace. This confidence itself was a weapon. It demoralized the Nazi leadership and emboldened resistance movements in occupied territories. Lieutenant Colonel Sterling in his debriefing made an observation that went to the heart of the matter. Himmler believed we would think like him, that we would see human beings as resources to be exploited, that we would accept any deal that advanced our position, that we would be willing to compartmentalize mass murder as an unfortunate necessity if it served strategic purposes. His fundamental error was assuming that because the Nazis would make such calculations, everyone would. He could not conceive of an enemy that would reject his offer, not because it was impractical, but because it was immoral. This moral dimension was not window dressing. It was central to the American and Allied strategy. The war against Nazi Germany was understood by the soldiers who fought it and the leaders who directed it as a war against an ideology that denied human dignity and value. To negotiate with Himmler, to treat him as a legitimate partner even in defeat, would have been to validate some aspect of that ideology. The Americans understood this. They understood that how you win matters as much as whether you win. And they understood that sometimes the most effective strategy is also the most principled one. Epilogue: The Lessons That Echoed. In the decades following World War II, the Himmler affair became a case study in military academies, intelligence agencies, and diplomatic institutes. Its lessons rippled through American strategic culture, influencing everything from Cold War policy to modern counterterrorism strategy. The most immediate lesson was about the power of information operations. The Himmler broadcast showed that carefully deployed truth could achieve objectives that would have required significant military resources to accomplish through conventional means. This insight would shape American psychological warfare doctrine for generations. From Radio Free Europe broadcasting to Soviet citizens to the psychological operations that preceded the First Gulf War, the principle remained: expose the adversary's contradictions, force them to confront the gap between their propaganda and their actions, and watch their authority crumble. A second lesson concerned alliance management. Stalin had been paranoid throughout the war that Britain and America would make a separate peace with Germany. The immediate public rejection of Himmler's approach and the immediate communication of that approach to Moscow strengthened the alliance at a crucial moment. Trust, the Americans learned, sometimes requires transparency, even when that transparency complicates other objectives. A third lesson was about understanding your enemy. The Americans and British had studied the Nazi leadership intensively. They understood the personal relationships, the power structures, the psychological weaknesses. This understanding allowed them to predict how Hitler would react to news of Himmler's betrayal and to exploit that reaction. In modern terms, this would be called human intelligence or psychological profiling. In 1945, it was simply careful observation combined with a willingness to see the enemy as human beings, flawed, emotional, capable of being outmaneuvered through their own weaknesses. Perhaps most importantly, the Himmler affair demonstrated that moral clarity and strategic effectiveness need not be opposed. The United States could have attempted to use Himmler to extract intelligence or concessions from him before rejecting his offer. Instead, the immediate categorical rejection sent a powerful message. America fights to defeat evil, not to accommodate it. This message resonated not only with Allied populations, but with occupied peoples throughout Europe. It confirmed that the American promise of liberation was genuine, that the Atlantic Charter's principles were not merely propaganda. The British military historian John Keegan, writing in 1993, observed, "The Himmler broadcast was a small moment in a vast war, but it encapsulated something essential about the American way of war. Americans in 1945 still believed, perhaps more than they would in later decades, that there was a right side and a wrong side, that some principles were non-negotiable, and that victory meant not just defeating your enemy, but discrediting his ideology so thoroughly that it could never rise again. In this case, they accomplished that goal with a microphone and a radio transmitter." Today, more than 3/4 of a century after that BBC broadcast, the world Himmler knew is gone. The Reich he helped build lasted 12 years and left only ruins and graveyards. The SS, his instrument of terror, was disbanded and declared a criminal organization. The concentration camps were liberated, their victims freed, their purpose exposed to horrified humanity. Himmler himself lies in an unmarked grave somewhere in Lüneburg, his exact burial site deliberately kept secret to prevent it from becoming a shrine for those who would resurrect his ideology. He wanted to be remembered as an organizer, as a man who got things done. Instead, he is remembered as he truly was, a mass murderer whose efficiency only made his crimes more monstrous. The Americans who defeated him, the intelligence officers who conceived the broadcast strategy, the soldiers who liberated the camps, the commanders who refused to compromise with evil, have passed into history. Most are gone now, their stories preserved in archives and memories. But the lesson they taught remains vital. That truth can be a weapon. that moral clarity can be strategic, that sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to an enemy is simply to expose them for what they truly are. On that April evening in 1945, when the BBC broadcast Himmler's secret proposal to the world, the Americans did more than destroy one man's authority. They demonstrated a principle that every generation must relearn. In the contest between truth and lies, between transparency and deception, between dignity and degradation, truth, properly wielded, strategically deployed, backed by force but not replaced by it, has a power that tyrants can never match. Himmler gambled that the Americans would think like him, would make deals like him, would compromise like him. He lost that gamble not in a moment, but in the years before it, when America decided what kind of country it would be and what kind of war it would fight. The broadcast was merely the culmination of that decision. It was the sound of America calling Himmler's bluff, and in doing so, calling the bluff of the entire Nazi enterprise. And it was, in its way, as decisive a victory as any won with tanks or bombs, a victory of character over calculation, of principle over pragmatism, of the unflinching truth over the most elaborate lie ever told.